Lord, open our ears to hear and our hearts to receive your words for us this day. Amen. Listen for the word of the Lord from 1 Samuel 2.
Now the sons of Eli were worthless. They had no knowledge of the holy God. The practice of the priests toward the people was when any woman or man sacrificed an offering, the priest's boy came while the meat was boiling, and with a three-pronged fork in his hand, then he violently shoved it into the pan, or kettle, or cauldron, or pot, and all that the fork brought up, the priest took for himself. This is what they did to all the women and men of Israel who came there to Shiloh. Even more, before the fat was burned to smoke, the priest's boy came and said to the one who was sacrificing, "Give up some meat to roast for the priest, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only fresh." And if the woman or man said to him, "Let them burn the fat to smoke first, and then take for yourself what you wish," he would say, "No, now you will give it, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of Eli's boys was very great in the sight of the Holy One of old, for the men treated the offerings of the Most High with contempt.
Now Samuel was ministering in the presence of the Holy One of old, a boy dressed in a linen ephod. A little robe would his mother make for him and bring him up year by year, when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Holy One repay you with seed from this woman in place of the bequest she made to the fount of life." And then they would return to their home. And the faithful one attended Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 2 daughters and 3 sons. And the boy Samuel grew up there in the presence of the living God.
Now Eli was very old. He heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay the women who were stationed at the entrance to the tent of meeting. He said to them, "Why do you do these things? I'm hearing evil things from all the people." "No, my sons, it is not a good report that I'm hearing the people of the Holy One of Sinai passing around. If a woman or a man sins against another person, God can be entreated. But if against the Holy One someone sins, who can entreat for them?" Yet they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the dread God to kill them.
Now the boy Samuel went on and grew in goodness with the Most High and with humanity. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches.
I don't know if this has happened to you, but often when someone decides to read through the Bible, they get bogged down very quickly in some of those Old Testament books. The books of the Torah, or the laws, the books of the prophets, or the historical books about king after king after king, with names difficult to pronounce and even more difficult to remember. It's enough to cause you to give up and go read something else. And that happens a lot. So it was when a Bible study group here at Hunting Ridge that met through the pandemic wanted to read through the Bible. That was their request. I suggested that maybe we would be better off to read a little bit of the Old Testament and a little bit of the New Testament every week so that we would not get bogged down. "No," they said, "we want to start at Genesis and we want to read all the way through to Revelation." And so we did. We started in September 2020. Somebody's got their phone on. We need to have that off in the room because it's echoing. Okay, thanks. We started in September 2020, and we finished at the end of May this year, 2022. We met every week. Some new readers joined us in November to read through the New Testament with us. So some have done the entire Bible and some have done the New Testament. We grew in many ways together as we read through the scriptures. We grew in understanding of the content of the Bible, and we were able to see and connect some things that we found in one place of the Bible when we read something further along. We grew in trust with one another. We felt over time we were comfortable to ask questions, none of which are dumb, by the way. We asked questions, we shared the differing interpretations that we had, and we encouraged each other to stick with it throughout the months. I think most of us would probably agree that we also grew in a kind of amazement of God's complete sovereignty, whose hands created, guided, chastised, and comforted the people of Israel, and then now non-Jews like us. We also grew in respect for the variety of writing styles that you find when you read through the Bible, in respect for historians who have put together the words into a timeline for us to understand the chronological list of the Bible, and the ongoing work of the Lord's Holy Spirit, who brings the life to this book and impacts our lives today. So we grew. We grew as we read the Bible together. We grew in the presence of the living God as we sought to understand God's messages for us today. Well, I hope that we also grew in goodness with the Most High. That's the wording that Dr. Wilda Gaffney used in the description of the way the boy Samuel grew in the process of ministering to the Lord in the temple of Shiloh. She wrote, he grew in the presence of the living God and grew in goodness with the Most High. God was never not a part of Samuel's life wherever he was. And God is never not a part of our lives as well. So this morning, as Jamie and I read together, we dipped again into the book of 1 Samuel, and we're picking up here today after Hannah's plea to God when she prayed for a baby because she couldn't have one. And after the birth of that son, whom she named Samuel, and after her heartfelt song of praise to God, because she knew that it was only because of God that she was able to bear a son. And here's a spoiler alert for you. We're going to stick with 1 and 2 Samuel for a long time this summer. So if you want to pick something to read, you might pick those books, and we're going to dig into them throughout the weeks this summer. You remember that Hannah had promised to loan her son to God. And he lived at the temple at Shiloh with Eli the priest. Samuel grew in multiple ways. He grew physically. He got taller. I heard somebody already say this morning, wow, Stanley Fossey has gotten a lot taller because I haven't seen you in a long time. So he grew in stature. He grew in height. Probably grew stronger. His mom, Hannah, came every year with her husband, his dad, to bring him a new linen garment because he outgrew it. And every year she made a new one at home and brought it so he could wear it there in the temple. I am sure she probably brought him some homemade goodies every time she went to visit as well. Samuel also grew in understanding what a life of faith should be. He was watching, as he was growing up, he was watching the contrast between the way the priest was supposed to act and the way that he saw Eli's sons acting. He saw Eli in the temple serving God. He saw Eli doing his best to be a priest for the community. And then he saw Eli's sons, who were also called priests, Hophni and Phinehas, who were not acting like a priest should act. So he learned about what was right and what was wrong as he grew in the favor of the Lord. He grew in goodness with the Most High. Another translation is he grew in favor with God. And so you got to think a little bit, well, so what does that mean? Maybe it means that God approved of what Samuel was doing and what he was learning. Maybe it means God actually had chosen Samuel for a special task, and God did do that. A specific assignment. Remember Mary, perhaps, the mother of Jesus, when she learned she was going to have God's son, she didn't know what she'd done to be so favored by God, to be living in goodness with God. So Samuel grew in goodness with God. He grew more and more connected to God, more and more able to understand God's ways, God's direction, God's expectations for his life of service. In the next chapter, we find the story of Samuel's call in the night. Perhaps you remember that, when God kept calling his name, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel kept thinking it was Eli calling him. That night, Samuel got a message from God that was a harsh word to give to Eli about the punishment of death for his evil sons. Samuel is growing as he serves in the temple, being forced to do something difficult and give a very hard message, or I might say an aggressive message to Eli, who he was working with. He's being shaped as he's growing into a man of God who would be looked up to by many. Now, the tribe of Levi were the original priests, descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. In Exodus and Leviticus, we find the very clear instructions for the people of how to take care of their priests due to their service to God and to the people. They were to be provided for with food after the sacrifices were made to God of the grain and of the meat. Well, this boy who's growing up under Eli the priest is seeing that Hophni and Phinehas are having a very crude way of taking the food for their family, for them. They grabbed up as much food as they could. It was they violently took their fork and stabbed it into the pot and grabbed whatever would connect to it before it was used for the sacrifice. And then they got demanding and greedy, and they said, we don't want the boiled meat, forget that. We want the meat before it's cooked because we want to have the fat off the meat, which was the part that was supposed to go to sacrifice to God. It's backward, what they were doing. That's not the way that the people had been instructed for the priests to be able to receive their food. Phinehas and Hophni are referred to as scoundrels in some translations, and Gaffney refers to them as worthless, which is a pretty strong comment about someone, to call them worthless. Not only are they abusing the community's procedures for providing food for the priests, but they sexually abuse the women who are outside, stationed at the gate of the temple, serving in some way. It's not clear what they were doing, but they were serving. They were maybe like the ushers at the temple, and they abused them. The whole community knew what they were doing. The whole community knew that they had a bad reputation. They didn't seem to be particularly secretive about their disdain for God. So what kind of priest would that be? Our narrator for this story is very clear. These guys do not fear or respect God, and they don't listen to their dad when he reprimands them. What happened to them? How did this result from Eli's sons? It appeared that the house of Eli had to fall to make way for the house of Samuel to rise. Scoundrels are made. They're not born that way. You're not born a scoundrel. So I wonder if there was something in their upbringing that was missing? Could Eli have spent so much time at the temple that he ignored the trajectory of his sons' lives? We don't know anything about the mother. There's nothing mentioned. Maybe they didn't have a parent who was as dedicated to their well-being, to their growing up in the goodness with God, like Hannah was, to make sure that her son did have that. Samuel clearly would have been told and probably retold the story about his mother's commitment to God and loaning her son. And then he lived the results of that promise, growing up in the temple. He knew that she had been blessed with additional children, giving him younger siblings. And he learned in that process how to follow God's path, and he watched what happens when you don't. This part of the story presents a great contrast between Eli's sons on the one hand and Samuel on the other. Eli was old and maybe couldn't see well, maybe couldn't hear well. That happens sometimes when you get older. Maybe couldn't move around so well. He depended on the neighbors to tell him what havoc his sons were wreaking in the community. They were great sinners on the one hand, and Samuel was great in his growing up in the goodness with God, becoming a mature man who would one day be respected and listened to. I wonder if Eli was getting a second chance with Samuel, a chance to make a positive impact on a child after his two sons had gone in the wrong direction. He wasn't an evil man, but he seemed inept as a parent, unable to redirect his sons from their evil ways now that they were adults. They were judged by God and killed. No second chances for them. It's a harsh story, and there are many in the Old Testament. But it paves the way, sort of cleans the slate, if you will, ends the era of Eli being the priest and his sons that is no longer, so that Samuel can now become the leader, become a prophet and a priest who guides the church, the community of Israel, into a new path, leading them toward the time of King David. God works through Samuel to lead the people forward as a nation who follows God. Now, when you're reading through the Bible, as we recently did, you find that didn't really work for too long. They were following God for a while, but not for too long. God keeps working with them, though. God sends prophets to push them and pull them along in the right way. God brings them home from exile. God gives the people chance after chance. We trust that God keeps working with us as well, even through our errant ways, even through our times of laziness, our times when we don't follow God's paths. We trust that there are ways for us to continue to grow in goodness with the Lord. No matter how old we are, no matter how much we think, oh, we got this down pat. You'll note when I call them forward in a few minutes that most of the people who were in our Read Through the Bible class have hair the color of mine. We have a lot of years of life experience among the group who read together. And all of us learned new things in the process. I can't tell you how many times in our class I heard people say, wow, I never came across this story before. Or, I never knew that was in the Bible. Or, so this is where we get that common phrase that we use a lot in our speaking with one another. Or maybe, I never looked at this section of the Bible this way. No matter how old we are, we can keep learning and growing in goodness with God. So I'm going to encourage each of you here today, and those of you on Zoom with us, I'm going to encourage you to find a way that you can grow in goodness with the Lord. First, you got to figure out what that means to you. So what does it mean for you to grow in goodness with the Lord? So you can think about that for yourself. Might be growing awareness of God's presence with you. Might be reading the scriptures, reflecting on them, letting them sink in. Might be putting yourself into the orbit, into the environment around someone you respect who's following God's path, who seems to be living in goodness with the Lord. It might be that you would be that person for someone else and be a mentor and a guide, and that helps you in living in the good, with the goodness of the Lord. So that's the first step. Think about it for yourself. What does that mean for you? And then secondly, pick one way, one step that you can take. Big step or small step? One step that you can take. Now, I challenged the children this morning to read the Gospel of Mark this summer, or be read to the Gospel of Mark. You might want to read the Gospel of Mark yourself, or you might want to read 1st and 2nd Samuel as we go through it this summer. I challenge you to take one step yourself in growing in your connection with God. Amen. I invite you to stand as we sing together hymn number 71. Seated.